Honourable Member for Port Moody, Coquitlam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Before I begin my speech, I would like to attempt to bring this room to a place of peace. I know this is a very, very sensitive topic, and we all have our ideas and all our passions, and some of us have different ideologies on this. But I think actually it's very beautiful that these heated debates are happening, because that is what is required to work through an issue like this. Life is not simple, it's complicated. When there are challenges, it requires being real and working through our emotions and our ideas until we come to a place where there is agreement and a compromise that everyone can agree on. So I've heard a lot throughout the debates of my party, my caucus, being accused of filibustering or trying to delay the passage. I find that a little heartbreaking, because this issue does have to do with life and death, and as was stated many times, death is final and it's irreversible, and it can impact people beyond the scope of those who are seeking it. So I would like to ask all members, rather than attack the motivation of other members on this topic, that we would continue in our debates, understanding that this is a very complicated issue and that we can have discussions being real, but to avoid comments like the minister made about the religious rights, which I find very offensive. Madam Speaker, hope is a journey. It is not something that can be bought like going through a drive-through to buy McDonald's. Hope is something that accumulates over time, and for different reasons, for different people, it requires a huge scope of places that the person who is struggling for hope goes through. It requires a full course to arrive at the doorstep of someone who is suffering. And sometimes it arrives unannounced. One thing I find troubling about this bill, and from the beginning, any time I've debated on this, has been from the perspective of hope. Because hope is the most sacred gift we have as human beings. We all go through life. Life isn't perfect. We go through life struggling, but the beauty of the human spirit is our determination to triumph over adversity. And we see things like this among so many people who came very close to even committing suicide. We look at someone like Christopher Reeve, a famous actor who was a superhero that everyone looked to as Superman, and yet because of a riding incident, he lost many faculties, and he did contemplate suicide. But with support in his very limited ways of living, he was able to live out the rest of his course of his life. And his ability to overcome his challenges, that makes him a greater hero. And I'm not saying this to belittle suffering. My father, I remember when I was 17, he was called into emergency into the hospital because his heart was beating irregularly, and at one point it actually did stop beating. And when I arrived to his hospital room, I saw his slippers, but he wasn't in his bed, and his roommate said, "Tread quietly, your father is in an urgent emergency crisis right now." So I stepped away and was frightened as a 17-year-old. And what had happened was, because his heart had stopped beating, they had put him on a bed and was steering him to the elevator to take him for emergency surgery. And the most traumatizing aspect of this experience was witnessing him jolting and screaming in pain because of the electric shocks that were coming onto him. It was a very painful experience to watch. And my father, when I was talking with him about this bill, recently said to me that in those moments, he had counted about 10 shocks before he passed out. He said it was the most tormentful experience he had in his life, that felt like someone took a hammer and was beating him down and he couldn't stop it or control it. And he said the only reason he fought through this to stay alive was the thought that he had 3 daughters to take care of. That gave him hope. And fortunately, he lived on and he has a pacemaker, so he's all right. But the reason I bring this up is to acknowledge that sometimes suffering is painful. And if I picture my father going through that every day to the point that he really wanted to die, I'm applying this, Madam Speaker, to those who are legitimately seeking MAID. And that law passed. This was debated in 2016 as C-14, and it passed. And the purpose, as I perceive it, was to offer a dignified death to those who would seek it. But, Madam Speaker, I take great concern with some of the details of safeguards that are removed from this bill. And I fear that these safeguards remove access to hope even more. There are many experiences and stories we've heard, even coming from the Justice Committee. And the time that is required when a person is suffering, say, something like spinal cord injury, requires more than 90 days to regain that trajectory of having hope and wanting to live. And granted, it is very painful, and I would never want to be in that situation, but there are those who overcame. This bill will allow a person who has just suffered a life-changing spinal cord injury, for example, to end their life just 90 days after the catastrophic event that caused the injury. And when a person is most vulnerable, experiencing unimaginable stress, a doctor will be forced to suggest ending their lives. And that's the option that's there. From my understanding from doctors and testimonies on the record at the Justice Committee, suicidal ideation after a catastrophic medical episode is very common, but has the possibility, with good care and support, that these transient suicidal thoughts can often take longer than 90 days to overcome. And in recent weeks, we've heard many of these stories of people who went through serious personal tragedy, but ended up living amazing lives and doing incredible things on the other end of it. I'd like to share with you the story of David Shannon. David suffered a spinal cord injury in a rugby scrum when he was 18 years old. He shared that after his accident, he lay in bed close to death more times than he wishes to contemplate. And yet he went on to have a career in a non-governmental organization with leadership, practices law. And this is a quote from him: "I've accomplished a lot in my life. I've crossed a great country by the power of my wheelchair coast to coast. I've jumped out of an airplane at over 25,000 feet. It explains all the things that he was able to choose to do because he chose to live." My fear, Madam Speaker, is that these safeguards being removed will create that truncation of hope that requires that full course for a person to regain their trajectory. And if that is truncated, the big question of what if. And this morning from the CBC article, the member from the Liberal government says, the article reads that he said he worries the resulting legislation may not address people who are transient in their wish to terminate their lives, such as someone who has a permanent disability or who now needs chronic care. Those feelings of anguish can fade over time as they adjust to a changed reality, he said. I think with a bit of time, some people may come around to the fact that there are reasons they want to live. I want to thank my colleagues for their heated debates. I appreciate where they're coming from, but I would like to ask each one also for a moment to take deep thought and ask, is it not worth protecting and safeguarding hope so that people who have that opportunity through a longer time to rediscover hope, to have a chance to live past that darkness into a place of light. Thank you, Madam Speaker.